While some families find healing in therapy rooms or textbooks, the Arnolds found theirs in the middle of a marble kitchen, with two tiny feet thudding to an old soul song and a maid dancing in yellow gloves. Pamela never meant to start a revolution, just to wipe the counters and mind her business. But one spontaneous moment with Leo and Noah shattered years of silence. And when Charles walked in, the world he'd built on structure and silence cracked open. Charles Arnold didn't believe in magic. He believed in metrics, strategy, and execution. The kind of man who could build $1 billion empire before lunch, but couldn't tell you what his sons liked for breakfast. Since his wife left 2 years ago, Charles had buried himself in deals and data, not diapers. The twins, Leo and Noah, had never spoken, never smiled, barely acknowledged their own father. Born deaf, they were quiet, withdrawn, unreachable. A fortress of silence wrapped in matching toddler pajamas. Pamela Brown was never meant to get close. Hired off a basic cleaning service listing, she came with no degrees, no credentials, just a mop bucket and a warm, unassuming presence. She didn't try to teach, she didn't diagnose. She just cleaned and sometimes hummed while she worked. The boys noticed first. Their heads tilted toward the melody. Their fingers tapped the rhythm. Slowly, like light leaking under a locked door, something began to shift. And then, one morning, as Pamela danced in the kitchen to Aretha Franklin with the boys stomping beside her, Charles turned the corner and stopped cold. He didn't yell. He didn't blink. He just watched. His sons were moving, laughing. One of them turned to Pamela and signed something rough, uncertain, but unmistakable. "Mommy." He backed away before anyone saw him, heart hammering, breath caught somewhere between awe and ache. That moment would haunt him, undo him, change everything. But it wasn't just a breakthrough for two silent boys. It was the beginning of a family that had been lost in plain sight, and it all began in the mansion of silence. But before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story makes you believe that nothing is impossible, if only you believe. Charles Arnold was late. Again. He checked his watch, muttered under his breath, and pressed the Bluetooth earpiece deeper into his ear. Somewhere on the other end, a junior associate droned about licensing updates and regional metrics. He barely listened. Down the hallway, polished wood echoed beneath his Italian leather shoes. The house, as always, was still. Too still. No voices, no mess, no surprises. He liked it that way, controlled, predictable, sanitized, until it wasn't. He turned the corner into the kitchen, eyes flicking toward the marble island, and stopped. Time fractured. The pristine, cold, million-dollar kitchen looked like it had been hit by joy. Actual, living, wild joy. Pamela Brown stood barefoot in yellow rubber gloves, arms raised mid-spin, hips swaying to music that thudded softly from a tiny black speaker on the countertop. Her mouth moved, singing maybe, and her eyes glittered with something ancient, something unfiltered, something real. But it wasn't her that froze him, it was them. Leo and Noah, his sons, 3 years old, born silent, born unreachable. Now they were shrieking and stomping on the marble island like tiny rebels in a revolution. Their hands flailed, their feet thudded in rhythm. One of them, he couldn't tell who, turned toward Pamela and signed something clumsy and crooked. Charles's breath caught in his throat. That sign. It couldn't be. He blinked, took one small step forward, then another. The music pulsed, muffled under the sound of the twins' laughter. Sharp, high, full of something he hadn't heard in years. And then life. There it was again. A sloppy little movement of the hands. The same one. The one they used to try during therapy, but never got right. Not really. Mommy. It was barely a sign. Broken, wobbly, but unmistakable. Charles staggered back like someone had slapped him. His hand gripped the doorframe. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He wasn't part of it. He was outside of it, watching, like a stranger peeking through the window of his own life. Pamela didn't see him. Or maybe she did, but she didn't stop. She laughed, she spun, she reached out her arms like a conductor in a symphony only 3 people in the world could hear. The boys twirled beside her, arms flapping, curls bouncing, faces bright. One of them, Leo maybe, lost his balance and fell on the countertop with a giggle. Pamela caught him with one gloved hand, lifted him back up, kissed the top of his head without hesitation. Charles felt something split inside him. Not just shock, not just awe, grief old heavy. Piled up grief. Grief for every moment he hadn't been there, for every time the boys had reached and he hadn't noticed, for all the silence he'd accepted like a sentence carved into stone. He backed out of the kitchen before anyone saw him. The hallway swallowed him whole. He walked fast, turned a corner, entered his study, closed the door. Silence. Real silence this time. No music, no laughter, no stomping. Just the soft hum of his breath and the roar of something breaking open behind his ribs. He sat down slowly at his desk, not noticing how his briefcase hit the floor with a thud. His hands trembled. He looked down at them like they belonged to someone else. Mommy. The word echoed in his skull like thunder in a cave. Had they said it before? To a therapist? To a photo? No. Never like that. Never with joy. Never with eyes lit up like stars. And not to him, to her, Pamela, the maid, the help. He leaned forward, pressing his fingers against his temples. She was dancing in his kitchen, and his sons were calling her Mommy. He didn't even know what song had been playing, but it hadn't mattered. The music was in their feet, in their laughter, in the movement of their small bodies, so full of life he almost couldn't bear to watch. For a long time, he didn't move. Outside, the world kept spinning. The stock market ticked, emails piled up. A video call waited. None of it mattered. All he could see was Leo, or was it Noah, with his hands outstretched, signing that single broken word to a woman who hadn't even been hired to speak to them. And all he could feel was the question pounding through his chest like a drum. Why her? Why her? Why not the specialists, the therapists, the expensive experts? Why not him, the one who paid the bills? Who stayed? Who tried? Hadn't he? But try as he might, he couldn't deny what he saw. The boys had come alive, and they hadn't come alive for him. They had come alive for Pamela. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. The music echoed in his mind, though he hadn't heard more than a few bars. Maybe it was Aretha, maybe Motown, something old, something warm, something with soul. He hadn't grown up with music like that. His parents weren't the dancing type. Silence had always been the language of his family. Silence and achievement. You don't cry, you perform, you succeed. But today, his sons had danced, and he hadn't been invited. That realization landed like a stone in his chest. He didn't know what to do with it. He didn't know what came next. He just knew this. Something had changed. Not just in his children. Morning came too fast. The house, normally still as a tomb at sunrise, buzzed with the quiet stirrings of life. Distant footsteps on tile, a faucet running, the low mechanical hum of the espresso machine in the kitchen. Charles stood in the hallway outside the pantry, hidden just out of view. Pamela was in the kitchen again. He could hear her humming, not singing, just a soft, absent-minded tune that drifted through the air like a thread of smoke. Something old and gentle. Something that didn't belong in a house like his. The twins weren't giggling today. They were watching her, quiet, alert. One of them clutched a wooden spoon like a baton, tapping it gently against the edge of the island. Charles stepped forward, slowly, intentionally. The music wasn't playing this time. No speaker, no dance. Just a woman in a worn sweatshirt and leggings, wiping down countertops with practiced ease, her back turned to him. She didn't flinch when he spoke. "What exactly are you doing with my sons?" The words landed like a slap. Pamela didn't turn, not right away. She paused mid-swipe, set the cloth down, then slowly pivoted to face him, Her expression was calm, not surprised, not defensive, just grounded. Charles stood stiff in the doorway, hands in his pockets, tie perfectly knotted. His face was blank, but his eyes flickered, tight, unreadable. Pamela folded her hands in front of her. "I was cleaning," she said. "That's not what I meant." A beat passed. The kitchen seemed to hold its breath. Pamela's voice was soft, but steady. "Then maybe you should say what you mean." His jaw flexed. "I saw them yesterday," he said. "In here, with you, dancing." Pamela nodded once, slowly. "Yes." He stared, waiting for an explanation, a confession, an apology. He got none. "And the sign," he added. "What did he say? Leo or Noah?" "I couldn't tell." "What did he sign?" Pamela hesitated. "He was trying to say, Mommy." Charles's breath hitched, but he pushed through it. "They've never done that before." "No," Pamela agreed. "They haven't." He stepped further into the room. His voice lowered. "So again, what are you doing with my sons?" This time she didn't look away. "I'm giving them joy," she said. "They deserve that." Something in his face twitched, a muscle under his eye. His mouth pulled tight. "They need therapy," he snapped. "Not games, not music videos and kitchen chaos." Pamela didn't flinch. "They've had therapy," she said. "Years of it. Speech, occupational, behavioral. Has it helped?" Charles opened his mouth, then closed it. "They need love," she said, voice gentler now. "And someone to see them. Really see them. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be present." That hit harder than he wanted it to. He stepped back slightly, crossing his arms. "You're a maid," he said. "Not a therapist, not a teacher, not family." Pamela's face didn't change, but her eyes darkened just a little. "I never claimed to be anything more, but you let them call you Mommy. They did that on their own. That doesn't make it right." Silence stretched between them, cold, dense. Finally, Pamela sighed. "I didn't plan any of this," she said. "I didn't teach them that word. I didn't expect anything. I just danced because they were laughing, because it made them happy. And for one moment, they were connected, awake, alive. Isn't that what you want?" Charles's voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't want them to get confused." Pamela's tone matched his. "Maybe they're not confused. Maybe for the first time they feel safe." That landed like a punch. He turned away slightly, jaw tight, staring out the window above the sink. Morning sun filtered through, catching dust in the air like gold. He wanted to yell, to fire her, to demand she pack up and leave before she made things worse. But he didn't. Instead, he spoke with that same clipped corporate tone he used in boardrooms and legal calls. Pamela nodded once. "I understand. No more music, no more dancing, none of whatever that was yesterday. I understand," she repeated. "I need order in this house, structure, routine." Pamela didn't argue, didn't plead. She just picked up the cloth again, went back to wiping the counter. Charles lingered for a moment longer, watching, listening, but there was nothing left to say. He turned and walked out. The twins, who had been hiding just around the corner, watching, peeked back into the kitchen. Pamela smiled at them. It was small, tired. She didn't speak. She didn't dance. She just went back to work. The boys stood silently by the pantry, their eyes wide. One of them, Leo, tugged at the hem of her sweatshirt, then pointed to the countertop where the speaker used to sit. Pamela shook her head gently. "Not today, baby," she whispered. The speaker stayed in her bag. The music stayed off. And the house began to feel cold again. Not the kind of cold you measure in degrees, the kind that seeps into the walls, into the bones of a place, into the pauses between words and the spaces between people. The twins became quiet again. Their stomping turned back into stillness. Their laughter faded. Pamela still smiled, still tidied, still hummed under her breath, but only when no one was around to hear it. Her movements grew smaller, her presence thinner, like someone afraid to take up too much space. Charles buried himself back into work, meetings, contracts, numbers. But at night, when the house was still, he would stand by the kitchen door, staring at the place where it happened, where something had broken through. He didn't know if he had made the right decision. He only knew that he hadn't been ready. Not yet. But the memory wouldn't leave him. The sound of laughter, the feel of it in the air, and that one broken sign. "Mommy." It haunted him. Because for the first time, his sons had called someone, and it wasn't him, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. The silence had returned, not the peaceful kind, the kind that soothes you at night or settles gently over a sleeping house. This was the other kind, heavy, weighted, the kind that presses down behind your eyes and makes your chest feel too tight. A silence filled with everything unsaid. 3 days had passed since the confrontation. Pamela still came, she still cleaned, she still smiled in that polite, neutral way that didn't reach her eyes. She made sure the counters sparkled, that the boys were fed and safe. But the lightness she carried, the spontaneous, magnetic joy that once moved through the house like sunlight, was gone. The speaker stayed zipped in the front pocket of her canvas bag. Charles had retreated into himself again. Long hours in his office, doors closed, voice sharp on phone calls, eyes shadowed when they passed in the hall. He hadn't spoken to her directly since that morning. And the boys felt it. They didn't understand boundaries, or hierarchy, or why something beautiful had been taken away. They only knew the music was gone, and with it, their connection to something they didn't have words for yet, something that felt like freedom. Leo, the quieter twin, had been watching Pamela when she thought no one noticed, watching the sadness tucked into her shoulders, watching his brother, who had stopped stomping across the kitchen like a wild thing, watching the empty countertop where the speaker once sat. This morning, something in him shifted. Pamela had stepped away to clean the upstairs guest room, and Charles was on a call behind the closed study door. Leo toddled toward the front hallway where her bag rested against the bench. He crouched, little fingers working the zipper loose with a quiet focus that surprised even his brother. Noah peeked from behind the staircase post, his thumb in his mouth. When Leo finally pulled out the small black speaker, Noah's eyes lit up. Leo placed it gently on the kitchen floor. He looked at Noah, then at the empty room, then pressed the round silver button. The speaker buzzed softly, then bloomed. Music filled the space. It wasn't loud, just enough to hum against the tile and echo off the glass. It was the same song, Aretha, rich, soulful, warm. The one that had changed everything days ago. Pamela heard it from upstairs. She froze. Her heart jumped into her throat. No. She ran down the steps, cleaning rags still in her hand, bare feet thudding against wood. As she rounded the corner into the kitchen, she stopped cold. The boys were already dancing, not shyly, not tentatively, freely, wildly. Leo spun in loose, uneven circles. Noah jumped on the balls of his feet, arms swinging, head thrown back in silent laughter. They were stomping, flailing, moving like music had always lived inside them and was only now breaking loose. They didn't see her at first. Then Leo spotted her. His eyes lit up. He pointed, smiled, reached out a hand, inviting her. Pamela's heart cracked. She wanted to say no, wanted to shut it down, follow the rules, respect the lines she'd been handed. She glanced toward the hallway, imagining Charles behind his office door. But the boys didn't know rules. They only knew what joy looked like when she danced. So she danced, one small step forward, then another. She lifted her arms, slowly at first, as if waiting to be stopped. But no one stopped her. The beat rolled through her hips. She moved, and the boys shrieked. They moved faster, giggling, spinning, copying her arms. One grabbed a wooden spoon and held it like a microphone. The other slapped the tiles like a drum. It was chaos again. Glorious golden chaos. Halfway through her second spin, Pamela felt it, the weight in the doorway. She turned. Charles was there, leaning against the wall, not moving, not speaking, just watching, his expression unreadable. The twins hadn't noticed him yet. Then, Almost in unison, both boys turned. They saw him. They froze. And then, their hands moved. Clumsy, crooked, unpracticed, but together. Dance, they signed. Then, Papa. Pamela's breath caught. Charles's eyes widened. He didn't move. The invitation hung in the air like a held breath. The boys looked at him expectantly, not demanding. Just open. Pamela didn't say a word. Charles stood there, blinking. He could feel it, the pull, the thread tying him to this exact moment. Something raw and unfamiliar surged up his spine. Fear, hope, shame, longing. He didn't know how to dance. He hadn't danced in years, not at weddings, not with his wife, not with anyone. But his sons were asking, "Dance, Papa." It was not a command. It was a gift, a way in. Charles stepped forward slowly, his shoes whispering against the tile. The boys bounced in place, still grinning, still waiting. Pamela backed up, giving him space. Charles paused in the center of the kitchen. He looked down at them, then at her, then back again. He raised one hand, then the other, then tried to mirror their awkward little stomps. It was awful, uncoordinated, embarrassing. The twins loved it. Noah squealed. Leo grabbed his father's pant leg and spun himself into it. Charles laughed, short, startled by the sound. Then again, louder this time. Something broke. Not a bad break, a release. He started moving more, looser, more fluid. He took off his blazer, tossed it onto a stool. Pamela stepped back in, not to lead, just to join. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Music filled every space that had once echoed with grief, and in the center of it all, a father, his sons, and the woman who reminded them all how to feel. Charles wasn't good at dancing, but that didn't matter, because in that moment he wasn't the billionaire, he wasn't the CEO, he wasn't the man with the perfect house and the shattered soul. He was just Papa, and his boys had chosen him. Charles hadn't planned to move. When the boys signed "Dance, Papa," he'd frozen. The words had hit like thunder in his chest, echoing too loud, too close, but his feet, somehow, had carried him forward. One step, then another. Now here he was, standing in the middle of his own kitchen, surrounded by two giggling toddlers and a woman who had turned his world upside down with nothing more than a smile and a speaker. Pamela stepped back, gently making space, not pulling him in, not pushing him out, just holding a circle open for him. Charles raised one arm, then the other, unsure, unsteady. His knees locked. His movements were jerky, uncertain. He looked ridiculous. The twins loved it. Noah shrieked with laughter, pointing at his father's stiff little sway. Leo stomped his feet and clapped, then mirrored the awkward shoulder wiggle Charles attempted. Pamela covered her mouth, eyes wide in disbelief, and something softer. He didn't stop. His body loosened. He forgot how to count the beat, but moved anyway. His tie slid askew, his shirt untucked at the side. He stepped left when everyone else went right. He almost tripped once, caught himself on the edge of the island, and kept dancing. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't smooth, but for the first time in years, Charles Arnold didn't care how he looked, or sounded, or failed. He was present, fully. The laughter in the kitchen grew brighter. It wasn't just noise, it was warmth, movement, joy made visible. He looked at his sons and saw them, not as diagnoses, not as responsibilities or regrets, but as little humans dancing like the world was brand new. And somehow, in the middle of all that chaos, something quiet inside him began to melt. When the song faded, they were all breathless. Leo flopped onto the floor, arms wide like a starfish. Noah leaned into Pamela's leg and squealed something only he understood. Charles bent down, placed both hands on his knees, and tried to catch his breath. He looked up at her, eyes meeting hers. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. He stood slowly, straightened his shirt, smoothed his hair, then looked around the kitchen like he was seeing it for the first time. The silence that followed wasn't cold this time. It was gentle, a pause between heartbeats. Pamela turned the speaker off. The boys clung to her hands, still bouncing on their toes. Charles gave them one last look, then nodded, just once, and walked out without a word. Not because he was angry, because he was overwhelmed. That evening the house was quiet again, but different. The air was warmer, less brittle. Charles sat alone in his study, the lights dimmed, the fireplace low and flickering, even though the California night didn't require it. On the desk in front of him sat a single envelope, a little worn at the corners, yellowed slightly with age. He'd written it the night she left, Olivia. He never mailed it, never showed it to anyone, just folded it carefully and kept it tucked at the back of his locked drawer like a secret. A confession he didn't know what to do with. The boys were barely a year old then, still waking up screaming in the night, still unable to hold his gaze, still so silent. And he had felt helpless, unfit, like someone had handed him a set of blueprints to build something sacred, only he'd been given the wrong tools. So he wrote the letter, not to win her back, but to say the things he couldn't bear to say out loud. Now 2 years later he reached for it again. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with the ache of wanting something more. The boys were already asleep slowly. Pamela was in the kitchen again, wiping down the stovetop with small rhythmic motions. She looked up when he entered, paused. Their eyes met. He didn't speak, just walked over and held out the envelope. Pamela stared at it, then took it carefully, like it might shatter in her hands. He nodded, then sat on the edge of a stool, saying nothing. Pamela opened the letter, unfolded it. She read silently. The words were raw, uneven, heavy with grief. He had written about the terror of being a father, how Olivia had always known what to do, how to soothe, how to reach, how to hope, and how, in her absence, he had felt like an imposter in his own home. He wrote that he loved his sons, but didn't know how to show it, that he feared they would grow up feeling unloved, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to be. He wrote that sometimes he stood outside their nursery door and listened to them breathe just to make sure they were still there, and sometimes he couldn't go in. He wrote that he wasn't enough. Pamela finished reading. The paper crinkled softly in her hand. She didn't look up right away. When she did, her eyes were wet, but not broken. She walked to him slowly, set the letter gently on the counter beside them, then said the only thing he needed to hear. "You didn't fail," she whispered. "You're here." Charles didn't respond, but something in his shoulders sagged, like armor being set down for the first time. She reached out and touched his hand, just for a second, not as a servant, not as an intruder, but as someone who had seen him, the real him, no title, no fortune, just a father trying to find his way back to his sons. And for the first time since his wife left, Charles didn't feel alone in the house he'd built to keep everyone out. The walls were still there, but they were thinner now, and on the other side of them, laughter waited. The house slept. It was late, past midnight, and the Pacific winds battered softly against the cliffside glass. Charles Arnold padded down the hallway barefoot, shirt untucked, a half-empty glass of water in his hand. He couldn't sleep, not after the dancing, not after handing Pamela that letter. He had felt something shift inside himself the past few days, a slow, cautious thaw. He had even stayed a little longer in the kitchen with the boys that evening, not rushing to his study right after dinner, just sitting, watching, listening. But tonight the house was still again, quiet except for the faint hum of appliances and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock by the stairwell. He passed the kitchen, intending only to grab his laptop, but as he stepped inside, his eye caught something unusual on the far counter. A notebook, small, spiral-bound, worn. The cover bent at the corners. It was open. Charles set his glass down and walked over slowly. He shouldn't look. He knew that. But something about the way the pages curled upward made him pause. He turned it gently. The paper inside was filled, not with grocery lists or cleaning schedules, but with sketches, little stick figure drawings, wobbly arrows, words written above them in Pamela's neat but slightly hurried handwriting. Happy, play, eat, sleep, love. Next to each word, a crude little sketch of a hand. Fingers bent this way or that, movements illustrated in arrows, American Sign Language, page after page. Charles flipped further. Dozens of entries, messy diagrams, notes like, remember thumb under palm, or use gentle face with this sign. He realized she had been practicing for weeks, maybe longer, alone, quietly, without being asked, all so she could speak to his sons. His throat tightened. He sat down at the counter, still turning the pages. The sketches weren't professional, some were downright clumsy, but the care poured into them was obvious. She had taken time she didn't have, learning a language she didn't need for a job she wasn't hired to do. He closed the notebook softly, stared at it for a long moment, then went upstairs. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows. Pamela was already there, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up. The boys sat at the island eating cereal, their feet swinging in small, uneven rhythms. Charles came in quietly, taking a seat at the far end of the counter. Pamela didn't look at him, but there was something different about her posture, an almost secret excitement in the way she smoothed the boys' napkins. She set the spoon down and crouched to their eye level. "Okay," she said softly. "Ready?" Leo and Noah both looked at her expectantly. Pamela raised her hands, slowly, carefully. "Happy," she signed it, a simple motion, hand brushing upward from her chest. The boys blinked, then mimicked her, small fingers fumbling. Their version was crooked, incomplete, but close enough. Pamela smiled. "Good, happy." She tried another. "Play." Her hands moved again, shaping the word like a gentle wave. The boys copied, giggling when their wrists knocked together mid-motion. "Play," Pamela repeated, laughing with them. Then she paused, looked at Charles. She raised her hands one more time. "Love." Her arms crossed over her chest in the universal sign for it. She held it there, still. The twins hesitated, then mirrored her. Two small sets of arms crossed, tiny hands pressing into their own shoulders. "Love," Pamela whispered. Their version was awkward, clumsy. One of them reversed the motion entirely, but the meaning was unmistakable. Charles felt something shift inside him again, a slow, rising warmth that pressed against his ribs. Pamela looked up at him. "Come," she said quietly. He stood slowly, almost unsure of his own body, walked closer. She showed him the motion again. "Love," she said, "like this." He tried it, his big hands awkward against his suit. "Love," he echoed. The boys beamed. Pamela moved closer, showed him another. "Papa." She guided his fingers gently into place. "Here," she murmured, thumb to chest, "like this." He copied her. The twins clapped. Then Leo, tiny, determined, looked up at his father. He crossed his own small arms over his chest, then tried to form the sign. "Pa!" The sound was broken, halting, but it was there. A word he had never heard from them before. Charles's heart seized. "Papa!" Leo whispered again, voice trembling but clear enough. Charles dropped to his knees, face crumpling. He reached for his son, arms wrapping around the boy before he even knew he was moving. Leo giggled, muffled against his shirt. Noah leaned in too, pressing against his father's other side. Pamela stayed where she was, watching. Her eyes glistened. Charles held them both, his shoulders shaking. He wasn't crying out of grief anymore. It was something else, a release, a thank you, a new language being born between them. He looked up at Pamela over their heads. She didn't say anything. She just signed one more time, love. He signed it back. Not perfect, but enough. For the first time, Charles Arnold didn't feel like he was standing outside his own life. He was inside it, knees on the floor, hands awkwardly shaping new words, heart wide open, and his sons, once silent, were trying to speak to him, not with perfection, not with fluency, but with love. And that was enough. It should have been a good day. The boys had signed Papa again that morning right after breakfast, Noah with a fistful of scrambled eggs, Leo with his hands still sticky from orange juice. They had looked up at their father with expectant eyes, waiting for him to sign it back. And Charles had, clumsily, slowly. But it had made them laugh, and they'd leaned in close, wrapping their arms around his legs like he was the most natural thing in their world. That joy, pure, uncomplicated, stayed with him. So much so that by mid-afternoon, Charles did something he hadn't done in years. He picked up the phone. He called Dr. Raymond Levitt, a renowned child development specialist. Not a family friend, but someone whose name came with credibility, Harvard credentials, and a waiting list longer than most private schools. "I need an evaluation," Charles said. "My boys. Progress report." Levitt agreed to swing by the following afternoon. Pamela was upstairs folding laundry when she overheard the call. She paused. Her hands froze mid-fold. Something in Charles's voice sounded too eager, too sure. She knew that tone. It was the voice of a man trying to prove something, not for the boys, but for himself. The next day, the air in the house felt different. Charles wore a collared shirt for the first time all week. He asked the staff to double-check the guest seating. He had the boys bathed and dressed in soft blue sweaters, matching khaki pants. When Pamela came into the kitchen, she immediately felt the shift. "What's going on?" she asked quietly, crouching to adjust Leo's sleeve. "A doctor's coming," Charles said. "Psychologist. I want him to see their progress." Pamela blinked. "They're not performers." Charles didn't look at her. "I just want someone to confirm what we've seen." She nodded slowly. "That's not how it works, Mr. Arnold." Charles didn't respond. Dr. Levitt arrived promptly at 3. He was tall, thin, and moved like someone used to commanding rooms without raising his voice. Wireframe glasses, clean notepad, expression neutral but tired. Charles greeted him with firm hands and a tight smile. The twins were brought into the sunroom. Pamela hovered near the doorway, uncertain if she was supposed to stay. Levitt began gently, his voice light, coaxing. But the moment felt wrong. Too clean, too staged. The boys sat stiffly on the floor, eyes flitting between their father, the stranger with the clipboard, and Pamela, who stood in the hallway like a shadow. Levitt knelt beside them, holding out flashcards and brightly colored toys. "Can you show me happy?" he asked. Nothing. Noah blinked. Leo turned his head away. Pamela's stomach sank. Charles watched from the edge of the room, fingers laced tightly in front of him. He leaned forward slightly, willing the boys to move. Levitt tried again. "How about play? Can you show me that sign?" Still nothing. The boys looked smaller somehow. Shrinking. Pamela stepped forward instinctively. "May I?" Levitt looked to Charles. Charles hesitated, then nodded once. Pamela knelt beside the twins. Her voice was soft, familiar, gentle. "Hi, babies," she whispered. "It's okay. You remember play, don't you?" She signed it slowly, gave them space to respond. Noah stirred. His fingers twitched. He almost signed back but stopped. Leo crawled closer to her, but his hands stayed still. They weren't dancing, they weren't laughing, they were retreating. Levitt watched for another 10 minutes, then stood, jotted a few notes. "Well," he said, adjusting his glasses, "it's not uncommon. Mimicry at this age, especially in nonverbal children, can look like progress. But without consistent responsive comprehension, I'd caution against premature optimism." Charles blinked. "I've seen them sign, spontaneously, they've said words." Levitt offered a small, clinical smile. "Children are intuitive. They respond to tone, rhythm, repetition. What you're describing is likely conditioning, not communication. They said Papa." Levitt nodded politely, and I'm sure that felt significant, but again, mimicry. Pamela stood up slowly, her hands curled into loose fists. Levitt gave her a dismissive glance. "Of course they are, but trying and progressing aren't the same." That was the moment Charles broke. His jaw clenched, his voice sharp. "Thank you, Doctor," he said flatly. "You can leave the invoice at the front." Levitt nodded and left without another word. As soon as the door clicked shut, the room turned to ice. Pamela tried to step forward. Charles spun on her. What was that? His voice was quiet, but laced with fury. Pamela froze. They were nervous. You saw it. He didn't give them time. No, Charles snapped. What I saw was two boys copying whatever you've been feeding them like a parlor trick. Her eyes widened. They weren't performing, she said. They were scared. That man didn't see them. Charles laughed bitterly. You think I haven't seen this before? Every specialist tells me to hope. Every time I believe, I get slapped with reality. You filled their heads with fantasies. You gave me false hope. Pamela took a breath. And then, calmly, they were silent long before me, Charles. I didn't give you false hope. I gave them a chance. He turned away. You want me to believe a maid fixed what an army of doctors couldn't? No, she said. I want you to believe in your children. Silence. Thick. Painful. Charles didn't answer. Pamela nodded once. Her voice broke just slightly. I understand. She turned and walked out. Later, she packed the speaker in her bag and didn't take it out again. The notebook stayed tucked beneath her jacket. Pages closed. The music was gone. The dancing was gone. The warmth, the lightness, the play. It all slipped back into the walls. The boys didn't cry, but they noticed. They clung a little tighter to her legs, sat a little quieter at meals, stared at their father with unreadable eyes. And the mansion of silence returned, not because of grief, not because of loss, but because hope had been mishandled. And Pamela knew, once it cracked, it didn't sing the same way again. Days passed. The house was back to quiet meals, scheduled cleaning, and long muted silences that stretched from morning to night like low-hanging fog. But something deeper had shifted this time. Pamela didn't hum anymore. She moved through rooms like a shadow, efficient, polite, detached. Her touch was gentle but distant. Her smile, when it appeared, was hollow at the edges. The warmth she once carried like sunlight through the halls was gone. The twins noticed. At first they became clingy, grabbing her hands, reaching up with wide eyes, waiting for a spark. But when none came, they began to pull back too. No more dancing, no more signing, no more spontaneous laughter echoing off the marble walls. The speaker stayed zipped inside her bag, untouched. The notebook, pages filled with the language she once believed would build a bridge, sat buried under her coat in the front closet. Charles kept to his study. He didn't speak to her much, and when he did, it was all logistical. Appointments, groceries, calendar reminders. Neither mentioned the doctor's visit, or the look in Pamela's eyes when he said false hope, or the way the boys had slowly wilted like houseplants in the absence of light. But guilt lingered, thick, bitter. It showed up in Charles's late-night pacing, in the way he'd start toward the kitchen, then stop himself. In the quiet glances he stole at his sons, searching their faces for signs of joy, only to find stillness again. Then came the quiet afternoon. Sunlight slanted through the tall living-room windows, catching dust motes in the air. The house was hushed, too hushed. Pamela was upstairs, folding fresh towels in the guest room. Charles was in his office reading the same line of an email for the 5th time. And downstairs, in the silence of the kitchen, Leo climbed onto the bench by the front door. He unzipped Pamela's bag. Noah stood nearby, watching with wide eyes. Leo pulled out the black speaker. His fingers, still small and dimpled, found the power button. The device blinked to life in his palm. A moment of hesitation. Then he pressed play. Music filled the air. Aretha's voice, low, rich, defiant, rose up like a memory. Noah gasped, then laughed. They didn't wait. They didn't ask. They climbed onto the island and began to dance. Not cautiously, not quietly. Wildly. Tiny feet stomping on polished marble. Arms flailing like birds testing wind. Their joy came roaring back, as if it had never left, as if it had only been waiting for someone to remember the rhythm. Upstairs, Pamela froze mid-fold, and in his office, Charles heard it. That sound, not music, laughter, loud, alive, free. Before his mind could register the thought, his body was already moving. He stood knocking the chair backward, walked fast, then ran, down the hallway, past the stairs, around the corner, into the kitchen. And there they were. His sons, standing barefoot on the island, dancing like the world was theirs. One of them had his shirt twisted sideways, the other was spinning so fast he almost lost balance, and in the corner, leaning against the counter, stood Pamela, still, watching. Charles stopped in the doorway. His chest tightened. The boys hadn't noticed him yet. Until they did. They turned, eyes wide, smiling, and then, those hands, up again, sloppy, wobbly, perfect. "Dance," they signed. Then, "Papa." The word hit harder this time, not because it was new, but because they still believed he would, still hoped, still asked. Pamela didn't speak, didn't move. She just watched. Charles didn't hesitate. He dropped his phone to the floor, kicked off his shoes, and sprinted into the kitchen. He climbed onto the island like a man possessed, like someone finally ready to answer a question that had been asked for years. And then he danced. Clumsy, uncoordinated, tie askew, shirt wrinkled. He stomped, he spun. He laughed, a sound so sharp and unfamiliar it almost startled the boys. Then he cried. Not the quiet, hidden kind he was used to, not guilt, not grief, relief, release. Leo ran toward him, throwing his arms around his father's leg. Noah followed, signing wildly, words that weren't clear but didn't need to be. And Charles gathered them both into his arms, holding them like lifelines. The music kept playing. Behind them, Pamela wiped at her eyes with the back of her sleeve. Not out of sadness, but because she understood what she was seeing. This wasn't about her anymore. It never really had been. This was about them. A father and his sons. Choosing joy again. Choosing presence. Choosing love. The kitchen pulsed with movement. Not perfection, not progress reports. Just life. Messy, beautiful, unplanned life. And for the first time since Olivia walked out, Charles didn't feel like he was failing. He felt chosen, not by a title, or a deal, or a legacy, but by two little boys who had never spoken a word, and who now used their hands to say everything that mattered. Dance. Papa. And he had. At last. The breeze carried laughter through the garden, soft, playful, unrestrained. It had been weeks since the boys danced on the kitchen island, calling their father into the moment he didn't know he'd been waiting for. Since then, everything had changed. Not overnight, but enough. Enough that the house no longer felt like a mausoleum built for silence. Enough that Charles had begun to leave his study door started to feel like something they were allowed to keep. Now the backyard, once pristine and rarely used, was alive. Paper streamers hung from the low branches of the lemon trees, fluttering like ribbons in the sun. Bubbles floated through the air, catching rainbows in their shimmer. A picnic blanket spread across the grass was littered with crumbs, plastic cups, half-eaten fruit, and laughter. Pamela knelt beside the boys at a fold-out table, her hands dusted in flour. She was showing them how to roll dough into balls, imperfect, lopsided little things that barely held shape. But the boys didn't care. They giggled each time one flopped to the tray, clapping their flour-covered hands and signing cookie with sticky fingers. They signed more help bake. Clearer now, sharper. Like their voices were coming through, not with sound, but with precision. Charles stood a few steps away, watching, not analyzing, not managing, just witnessing. There were people scattered across the lawn, his sister, a few close friends, a therapist who had once insisted the boys would never initiate communication. Now she stood silently, glass in hand, watching the twins sign with a gentle kind of awe. Charles moved toward Pamela. He held out a cup, lemonade, cold and beaded with condensation. She looked up, smiled, and took it. He sat beside her on the edge of the blanket, stretching his legs toward the sunlight. For a long moment they just watched the twins chase bubbles across the grass, their laughter blending with the wind. One of them fell and bounced back up with a squeal. The other ran straight through the streamers like they were part of the air. Charles exhaled. "You brought them back to me," he said quietly. Pamela turned to him, the corner of her mouth lifting. Not a full smile, just enough. "No," she said. "You brought yourself back to them." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She looked down at her hands, still dusted in flour. Then out at the yard again. "You were afraid," she said. Charles nodded. "I still am," he admitted. She glanced sideways. "That's okay. You stayed." That word hung in the air. Stayed. It carried weight, history, redemption. He looked at her. Really looked. Not as the maid, not as the unexpected variable that disrupted his routines, but as the woman who had stepped into a broken house and reminded everyone inside it that love wasn't something you schedule, it was something you show up for. The twins ran toward them. Noah got there first, barreling into Charles with sticky hands and a triumphant shout. Leo followed, sliding into Pamela's lap and signing dance before even catching his breath. They both talked more now, not full sentences, but sounds, effortful syllables, glimpses of speech, buoyed by confidence and laughter. Charles reached out and pulled them both close, one under each arm. They wriggled but stayed nestled there, giggling. Pamela leaned back against the tree behind them, stretching her legs beside his. They weren't anything official. No titles, no promises, no decisions made in haste. Just a woman, a man, and two boys in the grass, surrounded by sunshine, bubbles, and the smell of over-baked cookies. Charles glanced over. Pamela had her eyes closed just for a second, letting the sun touch her face. "Thank you," he whispered. She didn't open her eyes, but she smiled. The boys tugged at their hands again, pointing toward the streamer tunnel they'd made earlier. Charles groaned playfully. "All ready?" They signed Papa, then run. Pamela laughed, and Charles stood. "All right," he said. "Let's run." He took both boys by the hands, and together the four of them ran into the streamers. Not perfect, not planned, just present. Just love. A family, not built by blood alone, but by courage, by healing, by the willingness to dance in the silence, again and again, until joy found its way back home.